In favor, please raise your hand and say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please do the same. All right. Moving on, our next item of business. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes from the previous meeting?
Motion.
All right, I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, I have a motion and a second for approval of the minutes. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please raise your hand and say aye. Aye. All those opposed, please do the same. All right, moving on to our item of business for today, the financial update. Ms. MacArthur?
Yes, good evening. Thank you guys for being here on the committee tonight. We're going to talk mainly about revenues tonight. The first step in the budget process, as we met back in January, was kind of going over our budget parameters and our priorities. And so the next step in the process, we always want to look at what our revenues are and start looking at the components and the assumptions that we're going to use for our revenue calculations for the next year, because we want to know how much revenue we have before we decide how much money we're going to spend. And so we're going to go through our main sources of revenues tonight and talk about the different components that make up each one of those calculations and walk through those formulas. So the first item is our local property tax revenue. Of course, over 50% of our revenue comes directly from our local property tax revenue in our operating funds. And so there's several components that go to that calculation that make up to calculate our local property tax revenue. So we have to have our assessed valuation, and so we'll look at what we think our assessed valuation increase will be for next year. The new construction piece of that assessed valuation, our tax rate, and then what our collection rate, what we think that might be. And so those different components together is what we'll look at on the next couple slides to calculate what our property tax revenue might be for the 24-25 fiscal year. So this next slide shows the assessed valuation and new construction amounts historically for since our last tax levy was passed in 2016. And so you can see there the bright yellow lines are our reassessment years. Prior to the new assessor coming on in 2020, in Boone County, they really only did reassessments every 4 years. Well, the last few times they've done it every 2 years. And so 23-24, the current fiscal year, was a reassessment year. And so you can see our increase for the final assessed valuation. We talked a little bit about this at our last meeting, came in at 6.64%. And so that total increase column that you see in the middle of your screen, that is the total increase, not in revenues. That's the total increase in our assessed valuation from over the previous year. So our overall assessed valuation is about in the $3.2 billion range. And so what we're saying then that for the 23-24 fiscal year, our assessed valuation increased $200 million from last year. And so what we have to do to look at next year is decide what we want to use for our percentage increase in our assumptions for our revenue calculations for next year. And so what we have used historically was in the 3% range. That's a pretty conservative estimate. But if you go back, and so we have come in higher than that the last couple years. And so just talking through, but if you look at the last two non-reassessment years in 2020, 2021, we had a 2.09. And then if you look at 22-23, that was high, but if you remember, the large driver of that increase was because of our personal property, the personal property tax line that had the over 25% jump that year that really drove that increase. The real estate line, if you pull out personal property for 22-23, the real estate line was only 2% increase on that reassessment year in 22-23. And so next year is going to be a non-reassessment year because we had in 23-24 was a reassessment year. So we need to look at some historically. So if you look at the average over the last 5 years, it was in the 5% range. But again, as we look at those non-reassessment years, if you think at 18-19, we had 3.36, 20-21 was 2.09, and absent personal property in 22-23 was also more in the 2% range. And so I don't know if we talk through like what I'm assuming now is a 3% range, if there's any good feeling from, or we would talk about from the committee, if anyone had any opinions on if we have a crystal ball of what the assessment might be for the 24-25 fiscal year.
Quick question about the new construction, Heather. Are you getting that data are you averaging historical data? Are you actually getting value from for P&Z and things like that?
So the assessor gives us what our new construction cost is each summer when we get our preliminary assessed valuation. So from 23, 24 and historic down to, starting at the bottom from 16, 17, those are actual new construction numbers that is turned over from the assessor's office. And the reason why that is important is because we have Hancock Amendment limitations. And so when we're doing our property tax rate, which we'll talk about, in August when we set our property tax rate, there are Hancock Amendment limitations, which means there is a limit to the increase of the actual value of existing property on the books between 1 year and the next year. And so the fortunate thing or unfortunate thing of the last couple of years, the limit is our CPI or Consumer Price Index. Well, we all know inflation has been very high, so the increase in our assessed valuation did not equate to the limit that our CPI was the last couple of years. Previous to that, when the CPI was more in the 2% range, then we had several years where we had to roll back our tax rate because of those limitations that we have and the increases. So that might be something also that we have to take into consideration. But new construction, we can take the full amount of new construction. Any new construction on the books between 1 year and the next year, you get to count the full amount. And so you can see there for next year, if we predict a 3% increase, new construction is almost half of that amount of the increase because it's not an assessment year, reassessment year. And so those absent the new construction, it shouldn't be increasing, or real estate value shouldn't really be increasing beyond that CPI amount. Personal property tax or personal property lines, again, I do not expect a large increase like we saw last year. It evened off a lot this year in the 23, 24, and we're not seeing the wildly prices like in our used car market like we saw, coming out of the pandemic, and that's evened off a lot. So I don't foresee a huge jump in our personal property tax line again like what we saw a couple years ago. Any other comments? Okay. So as we saw on the previous slide, the assessed valuation, the new construction, those are two components. And then the other one is the tax rate then is the next component to calculate our property tax line. So this is our historical, the next slide that shows our historical tax levy. Again, we have not passed a voter increase levy since the spring of 2016, which took effect into the 16-17 school year. And so you can see starting at the bottom, there's been no voter increase, and we do not expect to have a voter increase for next year. So what our levy amount that we're projecting is for our operating fund is 4.07012, and so that should be pretty much the same as it is this year. There may be, you can see last year, there's usually a little bit of variability with our Prop C adjustment line, but it pretty much should be like last year was basically even from the year before. So insignificant. Also, each percentage of increase, so like when we were talking about a 3% increase in our assessed valuation, previously each percentage equated to about $1 million in revenue. And so that's increased since our AVs kind of inflated, increased over the last 5 years. That's more in the $1.5 million range now. So if it would come in at 4% instead of 3%, that would equate to about an additional $1.5 million in revenue. Again, just a reminder for everyone, the Proposition C amount is based on our sales tax. And so the way that statute is written, like if our sales tax, we roll back our tax rate equal to about 1/2 of what we receive in sales tax revenue. And so the reason we do that is it was originally when that law was put into place was to encourage people to spend locally on sales tax. That revenue is then collected by the state and funneled back to us. Well, and then and then in turn, we would give you a cut on your property taxes by rolling back the property tax rate equal to approximately 1/2 of our sales tax revenue.
And I have a comment and a question. And my comment I'm going to say, because it's just an echoing of Paul Cushing, I wish our property tax bill highlighted that. I
Right.
wish it showed how much was already being taken off in the tax breaks that are there through this space, because we don't have a Prop C waiver, half or full, and we're one of the few school districts that doesn't have some form of waiver,
Correct.
to give us some more of that income from Prop C. So that's my comment on that one. And then my question is, I know there's been some conversation in the legislature around increasing gambling and potentially replacing Prop C with that gambling money. Um, and this is me asking a out of the park question to you, and you don't have to have an answer. I'm just curious. I would assume, and do you believe that if that were to happen, I mean, we would see less money coming in?
So I do not have an answer to that,
Okay.
but it is definitely something that I don't know how they are calculating that gambling, the people, you would get as much money from gambling revenue as you would from sales tax revenue, or are they going to somehow do it on the calculation basis? Like currently our sales tax is we receive it based on our weighted average daily attendance. So remember the Department of, on the next slide, actually, and a couple slides will show how we calculate Prop C, but it's taken, you get an amount per weighted average daily attendance. And so that's how so if their sales tax remains strong, then they'll increase the amount that you're getting per weighted average daily attendance. So I don't know if they're going to do some sort of calculation that would be similar to that, and that's how they would funnel that money back from gambling revenues. It really would be how the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education and the legislature would decide how that is funneled back to school districts.
That makes sense. I know it's not massive dialogue, but I know it's been happening, and just a lot of things I've been reading haven't been looking too good on that front.
Yeah. Yes, and we'll also, in a couple slides, we're going to talk a little bit about some other stuff that's moving through the legislature now too. But any kind of limitation on any of a personal property tax or local control over our personal property tax revenue is basically bad for local school districts, especially in a school district that's very highly locally funded, where we receive over 50% of our revenue for operating directly from we don't want any kind of limitations on property tax revenue that we're getting, especially not those being placed on us by the state legislature. Unless they're somehow going to make that up in state revenue, which I doubt that's going to happen, personally. So talking about a good segue into our Proposition C sales tax revenue, that is our 1% sales tax revenue that goes directly into education, that's collected from our sales tax. Sales tax has remained strong. You can see we've had, coming out of 1920, we've had pretty significant increases each year in our sales tax revenue, has remained strong coming out of the pandemic. And so we've had the 4 or 5% increases, and we've actually had supplemental revenues. We've talked about that a couple times this year already, where we received late distributions of sales tax in the spring because sales tax revenues collected at the state level were higher than what they had originally appropriated that year. And so we ended up last year, or higher. You can see the amount per weighted average attendance for 22-23 was 1,286. Well, where it had originally been projected by DESI, and what we had budgeted was 1,256. The current year, there's not any information yet saying that there's going to be any kind of supplemental appropriation, but you could see they were pretty aggressive in the amount that they were budgeting, and so the budget was a lot higher. So we actually budgeted a 5.75% increase in our sales tax revenue. And so that's the amount that we're using right now of 1,360 is the amount per weighted average daily attendance that we're using for the current school year. And so the amount that DESI is coming out with for next year as 1,374, not as large of an increase, 1.03, but that's the amount that they're saying for the 24-25 budget that they're going to use for the calculation and distribution of sales tax revenue.
And with DESI saying that, that can change, though, at the end of the day.
Correct. And so fortunately, the last couple years has changed in a positive manner. It has not always, since I've been in this position, ended positively. Has been years where it's come in the spring, and the sales tax they've collected at the state level has been lower than what they were projected, and then they can move that amount downward in the spring distributions. If they see the sales tax, they watch it as it's collected each month and it's turned over. There's actually like a 2-month lag between when it's collected and when it's turned over to local school districts. And so they can adjust that amount per weighted average daily attendance that they're distributing to local school districts up or down, depending on how strong those collections are each month.
So part of that formula is the weighted average daily attendance. And going back to previous meetings, that's been improving over the last couple of years. So are you saying that as that improves, they have a tendency to take the other side of the formula and reduce it? Is that what I'm hearing?
So for the weighted average daily attendance, actually since 1920, they have put that statute has been in place where they have allowed us. Typically, you have a 2-year look back period for the weighted average daily attendance, but they've extended that now 2 years. And so most school districts, because you saw a drop in enrollment of our ADA coming out of the pandemic, most school districts have not rebounded to what those pre-pandemic levels are. CPS is still using our 2019-20 weighted average daily attendance, so it's been flat. So we haven't had to take a dip because of the decline in enrollment. And so I predict that our weighted average daily attendance for next year, our enrollment has basically, we're within 100 students this year for 23-24 as we were for 19-20. So we're basically almost flat like we were pre-pandemic. So when we're talking about the average daily attendance, but there's also that attendance percentage. That's the one thing that has not rebounded. And so I think our membership, our enrollment, which is the piece of that WADA calculation, is going to be basically what we've used for the last several years. There will be a little bit of that variation with our attendance percentage, but the other piece is the weighted factor, which we'll look at here in a minute when we talk about our formula revenue. Those DESE provides weighting factors for our free and reduced lunch, our special education, and our EL students. And so those weighting factors also are determined by certain percentages each year, and they can go up or down. Next year, they're actually going down, which means the threshold to be able to meet the additional weighting factor is less, which means actually more districts will qualify because the percentages are less to be able to qualify. So taking all that into consideration, I do think our weighted average daily attendance is going to be around the same amount as it is this year. I think membership's going to be flat, attendance percentage is going to be lower, weighting factors are going to be higher. I think it's all going to balance out in the end. It's going to be around what it is this year.
So we talk a lot about attendance and how that impacts achievement. This is another one of those places where attendance and going to school is really, really important.
Yes. And they don't care why you're not in school. If your butt is not in the seat, you're counted absent. They don't care if it's excused absence or you're at Disneyland or at the dentist or where you're at. If you're not there, then we're not getting counted in our revenue. That counts in our revenue. So a little conversation I have before we go into our state revenue lines. And so in January, the governor usually announces the budget, what his recommendations are for the next year. So for fiscal year 24 for the K-12 budget recommendations coming from the governor was additional money going into the formula, which is our state adequacy target, is one of those components that we'll use in that calculation, is going to increase from 6,375 to 6,760. Also, he is recommending full funding of the transportation formula, which is an additional $14 million statewide into transportation formula. A couple other things that he's going to continue to increase that teacher baseline salary grant program. And a lot of schools are using where they raise the minimum teacher salary. It went up to $38,000 for the current year. They are recommending that goes up to $40,000. CPS does not get any of that money because our our minimum teacher salary is already above that amount and will be more than that for next year. But for the current year, that it's at 40,900 is what our current base salary for our new teachers are. And we don't really know like how it's moving through the legislature, but the House Budget Committee is not planned to make any recommendations until right before they come out of their legislature spring break, which is March 18th to 22nd. So all of these things are good news. I mean, we haven't had an increase in the state adequacy target for 5 years now. So that is good. We have the continuation of full foundation of the transportation. That is good. This will be the 3rd year in a row that's happened. We talk a lot about fund balance in here. The state has a very high fund balance right now, and so they are also being criticized for having that money. So they are flushed with cash, and are going to fully fund these things for at least committing to for 1 year. What's going to happen after that? We don't know. Everyone's talking about this fiscal cliff that's looming out there, especially at the state level, like once they, for the next year. So we don't know what's going to happen for 25, 26, but I'm pretty confident those first 2 things are going to happen for the 24, 25 school year.
And Heather, I mean, on the teacher baseline salary grant program, I mean, I think it's great that the state is increasing where the state is dictating the minimum, but I fear how this de-incentivizes local areas increasing their tax levies, because currently districts across the state that have had a higher minimum from the last increase that occurred to get it to 38 and this proposed one have seen no access to this grant. And so I do think that that's something that we as a community and the board is really going to have to kind of wrangle with is citizens looking at this and going, well, if the state's going to increase it and they'll give you money, if we don't, then we'll wait for the state to increase, right? And I think that's a really hard conversation, right? And really pointing that out.
I literally it's weird saying that because we've got teacher friends that are watching and everything. And I'm like, so if we dropped our starting salary or base salary to 38, the state's just going to give us money to cover the difference. Then that's kind of how.
It's a match
Yeah.
program.
Right, it's a match. And so the other side of that is
We don't want to do that.
right,
Let's
correct.
get
We
that
do
out there.
not
We're
wanna
not going to do that.
But
Let's
a lot
not
of
do
these-
that. No.
A lot of smaller districts, especially that have had to do that, it also causes compression. And because when they have, and what that means is when you have a salary schedule where you have columns and you have steps for experience, they fund, to get your minimum teacher, but then that means you could have your first 5 years, years 1, you're getting 0 raise, you're at 38,000, or if they move it to 40,000 because they're funding it to get up to that. But then your high end of your salary schedule is very compressed, and there's years that you probably are not going to get what we call a step raise, where you're stepping down because they can't afford to put any money down. All they can afford is what the state's giving that additional revenue to get the minimum up, but it's not giving you any additional revenue to raise the rest of your salary schedule. And so we talk about indexing and how basically your salary schedule is an Excel spreadsheet, so everything's indexed and so theoretically you want, as your beginning salaries increase, you want that to triculate down all the way to your ending salaries are increasing as well. And so what's not being able to happen is when you have these grants that is only funding a portion of them, if these districts don't have local support or don't have any additional revenue to put into the rest, then they're veteran teachers and it's not good for retention to be able to keep those teachers after a certain, because they're no longer getting raises or their salary schedules don't step till year 30 like ours do, and it's no longer beneficial for them to be there after a certain number of years.
And the other thing too is the grant program isn't guaranteed to always be funded and remain. Like many of the other things, like with funding for transportation and with SAT increases and proposals there. I mean, I think the state can say a lot of great things and promise a lot of great things, and sometimes they've been able to pull through the last couple of years and potentially can pull through this year too. I think something that can be forgotten, though, because we had a couple great years where this has occurred, is that it might not be there next year or in the coming year. And so the local districts then get on the hook for any massive changes that they have made to their salary schedules or to their FTE if they haven't really projected on can retain
Sustain
and
it.
sustain even if there is a dip.
Correct, correct. And so, just to be clear, there's been no increases to the formula in the last 5 years. So, yes, they fully funded transportation in the last 2 years, but there has been no additional money put into the overall ADA amounts that they're using statewide because of the fall off after COVID. The number that they're distributing based on our ADA is lower than what, and they have put, the SAT had not increased since 1920. And so, yes, they were able to put some, and so I think it's great that we're increasing almost $400 because it's really, it's right between 5 and 6% is what the increase from 6,375 to 6,760. Really, if you would have done that over the last 5 years, that's 1% each year. So it's not, if you take into the fact that they haven't increased it over the last 5 years, it's really not as significant. It is, and we are fortunate that we're going to have that additional money for next year. Whether they can sustain it or not after 24, 25, I do not know the answer to that. Whether they'll continue to fund the formula, I don't know that anyone can count on that either. Same thing with this teacher baseline salary grant. They've promised it, I think, for one more year, but whether they can, and so then these districts really have to figure out how they're going to be able to like absorb that with district local money, or is there going to have to be some sort of other way that they're going to have to change their salary schedule to be able to continue to pay that.
Just clarify, when you say ADA, you mean average daily attendance. Okay, when we got into transportation, I didn't know if it switched to American Disabilities Act.
No,
There was some
yes,
kind
I
of-
correct.
okay.
Yes,
Thank
sorry.
you.
Yes, average daily attendance. And so, yes, so this really, the majority of this is good news. This next slide is, there is a lot of variables, and I usually like to have a better idea of what we're going to have in revenues by this time of year, but there is a lot of variables moving through the legislature right now that could also negatively affect our revenue. And so the big thing is any kind of the school choice bills, the charter schools and the vouchers is the big one. There's multiple different Senate bills now, 1392, 1391. They've also tacked on 727, which is really the voucher bill, but now they've added amended language to add the charter school language into that, which is really the voucher bill, to try and pass some sort of legislation regarding this in this session. And so again, the reminder of why this is not, there's no accountability concerns with oversight and accountability of charter schools. They're inefficient. When you look at charter schools in St. Louis and Kansas City, a lot of them still have poor academic performance. They have financial issues, inefficiency, and they don't have any elected boards or any kind of oversight. And so any kind of thing that would move, even if it's only 100 students, or when you have 40 different buildings and you have one student from this grade and 2 students from that grade in this school, like, you cannot reduce the expenditures at the amount that you would reduce revenue by if these students were being pulled out of public into a charter school type environment. Even open enrollment's the same thing. Anything with moving students out to a different district. And also with charter schools, it's not just the state funding that follows the student, it's the local funding that follows the students now. And Linda Quinley, who was my former boss, who was also in Kansas City for 5 years, is volunteered her services to come educate, have a open session sometime to talk about how that funding affected Kansas City public schools and show the calculation of how that works. But that's the kind of stuff that like keeps me up at night because it's significant. Each one of these different things, any kind of limitations on property tax, we saw the Senate Bill 190 that passed last year, and now the county is trying to control how we implement that in Boone County for the the limitation of the tax on senior citizens. There's also several different property tax bills continuing to go through the legislature. Again, every year they try, any kind of limit, like any one of these things could be equal to $3 to $4 million in revenue, whether it's charter schools, whether it's limitations on property tax, whether it's open enrollment, So those are the things on the negative side of things that we have to continue to take into and somehow factor into our future and our financial model for the next 5 years as well.
With the county Prop 1 on the ballot in April, I was curious to know, would, and you might not know, right? And obviously, as you shared, if it passes, the county commission has some like leeway of how things go, but out of possibility, would that impact how assessed valuation is increased in those areas?
It definitely will. So that's how our revenues and are negatively impacted because there's caps on. So there will be certain people that previously had to pay taxes that will no longer, or that increase in the revenue will be there. There will be limits on their increases to their assessed valuation because there's certain portion of the population that won't have to pay property taxes. So that definitely could, balance out. It could be a decrease because of that. And so in the assessor's office, the county doesn't have a good idea. So that's why the county really wants to have some control over the process, because there's going to, if they can put parameters around how that, is affected and how it's implemented, then they can control that rather than at the state level where every county operates a little bit differently. In Boone County especially, like, we want to make sure that we can control that, and they have to put things in place so that they can't even really tell you like the percentage. It could be anywhere between 10% of our population that this affects to 20% of our population, which could be anywhere between $3 million and $6 million. So, I mean, that's a huge difference when we're trying, to the school district, when we're trying to calculate that amount, that it's going to be, how we're going to be affected by that.
Yeah, because I had thought it was only going to impact like if we raised the levy or something like that, right? But then as we were talking about assessed valuation, that's why I asked. 'Cause I was like, oh, will that impact that? So it would.
No, it'll be in the assessed valuation line is how will not, because those people will not, because of those valuations they'll not be assessed for the population, those different parameters for, senior citizens over age 65 and different things. But
Yeah.
also there's a lot difference between the people that we want to help who is in that age bracket and those people maybe that are millionaires in that same age bracket, that you don't necessarily want to have a tax break.
Would it be fair to say that if some of these different bills pass, and I mean, effectively that's going to take money out of our one pot, we've got a payroll to keep.
Correct.
We have millions of dollars of maintenance and everything else that we've got to do. So our options are kind of either we've got to cut things that we potentially don't want to cut, or we have to, effectively increase taxes for the folks who would still owe us those taxes and things.
Correct.
So it's not really good for anybody if these sorts of things kind of happen. The ideas may have some merit, but at the end of the day, if it's removing money from our one pot, we've got to either make cuts or we've got to figure out more ways or other ways to get more money, which is
right.
not
additional
ideal.
Sources of revenue,
right.
Or less spending or additional sources of revenue. Yes.
And I mean, if any of that happens, even if all the optimism on the previous slide that you just shared, something like this could negate all of that and make, or even more, gone. On a charter school note, I was having a conversation with a district administrator over in the Kansas City area, and it was very interesting how they shared around the fact that they had some charter schools in the past couple years who were up for review and was worried about not being able to be extended, asking Kansas City Public Schools to help them. And I think that just is another piece of the narrative of just where there is not a lot of successful charter schools here in the state. There's a handful of them, and the majority either get their 5-year contract renewed to continue operating, even though they are not performing better than their local district, public school district, or they fail for financial reasons, or just because it's just even more abysmal academics. And so it's I think it's hard to make. I don't understand how this is an argument when we have these examples, and for years, decades of examples now in Kansas City and St. Louis.
That's a good point. Thank you. Okay, switching gears a little bit to talk about then what goes into the factors for our state funding. And so a reminder, just our local funding is about 64%, and 50% of that coming from our local property taxes and around 10% from prop seats. So right about 60% comes from those two sources of revenues and some other miscellaneous local revenues like investment interest and those things. It comes up to about 63 or 64%. Then when we switch over to our state revenues, state revenues make up about 30% of our operating budget. So when we calculate the state foundation formula, the first thing is what we talked about, the state adequacy target. And so that is something that comes out from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And then that is multiplied then by our weighted average daily attendance. And then we get additional weighting factors for those different subgroups, our free and reduced lunch, our IEP or our special education students, and our LEP, which is our English language students. And then the funding allocation is the final piece of that. And so the next couple slides, and so some historical data of each one of those different components. You can see here our this is our state adequacy target, and you can see since 2020-21, 6,375 is what we've remained flat on, and so we are proposing for the 24-25, and this is what's come. DESE is projecting 6,760, and what the governor is recommending will be fully funded for the 24-25 fiscal year, and then they bump that up an additional $385 to $7,145 the following year. And then the next piece of that, again, and just if you want to talk about numbers, our foundation formula funding is about $65, $66 million in total revenue. And then our weighted average daily attendance is calculated by you take your membership, and so like when you have count days, we have count days here in September and in January each year, and so you take your membership of those two, and then you average those two numbers together. And there's usually second semester is typically a little bit just because of some December graduates and some things where membership falls off second semester and slightly lower, and so you can see then they average those two amounts together, and then you multiply that out by you apply the attendance percentage, and so that's how you get your average daily attendance. And so you can see there our average daily attendance has remained flat because we were able to use the 1920 average daily attendance for the calculation for the last 3 years coming out of the pandemic due to the decline in enrollment statewide. That came out from the state legislature that we were allowed to use that. Again, like I said, our membership, like for the current school year, is basically equal to an amount or almost equal to an amount that it was in 1920. So I don't think that's going to fluctuate that number significantly for maybe slightly. So that's what you're getting. You can see our ADA is slightly below what it was, but not significantly below what it has been for the last few years. But then the other thing that you can then apply are the weighting factors. And so those percentages are also that come for so if you meet the threshold of the percentage that is given by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, then you get additional weighting factors in your average daily attendance. That's how it becomes the weighted average daily attendance, the number that you use and to multiply out for the formula. And so you can see the free and reduced lunch percentage to be able to qualify to get the additional weighting factor is going to drop significantly for the 24-25, and they usually set these rates and then they're the same for the 2 years. And so reminder, like if you drop it, that means more districts are going to qualify for it. The number that's over that threshold is going to be higher. Same thing. So and then our IEP at 13.30% and the LEP, which is our English language, at 2.09. So Columbia does not, our percentage for our IEP students is right around 10%. So historically, we have never qualified for the additional weighting factor for our special education. But we do qualify both for free and reduced lunch and for our English language for both of those subcategories. And so then you see that this next slide, then how that's calculated. So our regular term, to get the weighted average daily attendance, you take your regular term ADA, which is your membership for your September and your January, you average those two amounts together. And then you get to add in any districts that have summer school, you get those additional average daily attendance for summer school. And so that amount depends on, we've been in the 700 range for the last couple summers. And so I predict that's going to be pretty much equal, and that will be based on the current 2024 summer school number. So then you get your total ADA amount. And so then once you get that total ADA, you'll get your additional weighting factors. And so you can see the free and reduced weighting factor is going to increase because of that drop from the 30% down to the 16%. So that's why when we were talking a little bit before, like our overall membership might decline, but our weighting factors are going up. So our bottom line is going to be pretty much the same, not significantly different. LEP as well, our English language, we've continue to talk about every year how this has doubled over the last 10 years. And so we're in the 15 to 1,600 students that now are qualifying for our English language. And so that is that additional, by reducing the threshold there, is going to increase that additional weighting factor from 492 up to 634 is what we're projecting for next year. We also do get some additional for our pre-K. Some of our pre-K, and the reason this number is low, obviously we have more than 100 students in our pre-K program because part of it's title funded, so you can't double dip. So if it's funded by title, which is federal, you can't also claim those same students for state aid. And so that's why there's a balance there always. And then you get our overall weighted average daily attendance. And so it's going to be in the 18,000 range again for next year. And that's what we're going to use then for the calculation for our basic formula. And then the other piece of state revenue that is our state transportation. So we talked about before, we were in the less than 20% in 21 prior to the 22-23 school year when they fully funded transportation. You can see the large jump in our transportation revenue. We actually, the previous 3 or 4 years, we had declined in revenue and for the transportation line. And then in 22-23, we had the big jump from 1.6 million to 5.6 million in additional revenue. And just a reminder about how that transportation revenue is calculated on, we submit the application of state transportation aid as part of our annual Secretary of the Board report, which is submitted in August of each year. And so it's based on the prior year data. So the current year transportation revenue is calculated based on the information that we submitted for our ridership data and our transportation expenses for the previous year. And so we projected between 22-23 and 23-24 as our transportation expenditures increase, then that revenue increases as well because it's based on our expenditures for the prior year. So what I'm saying, if they are fully funding transportation, we're going to see an additional bump in our transportation revenue because our current year expenditures for transportation were more than our prior year expenditures. And at max, just a reminder, our max, because you'll see on this next slide as we kind of switch gears and talk a little bit about fixed costs and transportation expenditures. The maximum, if they say fully funding transportation, the maximum is 75%. If you meet all their other requirements, the maximum transportation at fully funded is 75%. So, and there's always going to be some things that we specifically do in Columbia that are never going to meet so like any kind of shuttles, if we're shuttling from high schools to the Career Center or high schools to the Triple E program or to Douglas. Any kind of shuttle's never going to qualify for additional revenue. So that's always going to be something that's locally funded. Any kind of lottery school things where there's an efficiency factor where we're driving there's some of that's never going to be fully qualify for fully funding for revenue to be reimbursed for those type things. And so even though they say we're fully funding, you're going to see like really the revenue at best is about 50% of what our transportation expenditures are, as you'll see on the next slide. But it's much better. I will say it's much better than 1.6. I will take the 6.5 over 1.6. Yeah. But it's never going to be an apples to apples. So as we start talking about expenditures, obviously those two numbers are not the same. So when there's fully funding, I just wanted to preface this conversation. That's kind of the last thing I wanted to talk about revenues today before we just, there's a next couple slide. We usually talk about some of our fixed cost projections that we do for those, or something, those things that we're gonna have to pay to get kids to school. We have to pay to have electricity in our building. We have to cover our insurance and those type costs. And so it's those things that we have to continue year after year, but those different line items that we have to factor in to our 5-year model as we're starting to look at those expenditure lines. So student transportation is obviously our largest fixed cost, and you can see here some historical data on our student transportation. And we did drop off significantly, and so this was the first year that we were back up over $12 million in transportation since prior to the pandemic, because of course we went virtual, and so 1920 and 2020, 21, there was some anomalies in those couple years, and that's why we saw those decreases. And so you can see then since 21, 22, we've continually increased in our transportation again. And we talked this time last year about with the renewal, we were on the first renewal option for STA, and they had requested about an 8% increase in their contracted costs. They wanted to be able to give drivers additional raises. As I went through the projections, because of some efficiencies and number of routes that we were running into, it's about what we're projecting right now is about a 6.34% increase over what our final expenditures were last year. So fuels went down a little bit, evened out from last year where it was. So there's some other things that are in that line that it wasn't the full 8%, but it's close. And then we know that we the board already approved the second renewal option for STA for the 24-25 school year, and so we're locked in at 2% increase for that final renewal option for that. And so that is really good news from what we've seen over the last several years, that only project a 2% increase in our transportation costs. So we know that's going to change the year after that when we switch our contractors, as we just to the 25-26 school years when we're going to switch our transportation contract. And so we already know that we have to factor in about an additional $3 million into our 5-year plan for the switch of that contract the following year. But again, for next year, really 250,000-ish for our increase in our transportation costs.
Heather, just to refresh my brain, that $3 million additional over the 5 years, that is over the 5-year, not just an increase each year?
No, it's an increase each year.
Okay, I wanted to make sure I was understanding
So
that
jumping
correctly.
about from 13 million up to about 16 million
Yeah, okay.
the first year. And then it's about a 4% increase each year in between.
Okay.
And that was with the new company, correct?
Yes, correct.
Is a large portion of that due to that switch, or is it just both contracts are increasing that, both options?
All the options that we had to consider were an increase. Yes. So and that's based on a daily rate that they give us, and we know the driver shortage and so all the contractors that we brought in, all the requests for proposals that we reviewed had increased rates significantly. And because they're trying to be aggressive too with trying to recruit drivers and trying to be able to maintain their costs. There was a little bit of fluctuation in between the vendors, but we are going to see a pretty substantial increase regardless of which vendor we chose. Maybe $500,000 in between the lowest and the one what we chose, but there's also some different services that they were offered that one were balanced out, that we wanted to make sure that we were taking advantage of some better technology, some better organization structure in the central office, and those type things that we wanted to make sure that we were taking advantage of as well.
But you're looking at $16 million on an annual basis.
Yeah. So, which will be another conversation we have as we start looking at attendance area at work too, and transportation and moving boundaries too. That's always a big conversation that you have to factor in.
I'm going to ask you another question, which I know you're going to be like, I don't want to answer that question. As a guesstimate, if we stop doing lottery schools at the elementary and middle school level, I mean, on transportation, what could be the savings?
I'm not gonna guesstimate.
That
off the
that's
top
fine.
of
I
my
get
head.
that. But there could be
There
some
could be.
savings that
There
were
could
to
be,
exist there
yes.
if we were to get rid of that lottery system.
Yes, there could be, yes, yes. Because those schools, like, those buses go all over town instead of just in a specific neighborhood school area. Yes,
Yes,
correct.
that is not me foreshadowing. That is not me asking any plans. It is me asking hard questions that I know maybe our community doesn't want asked to understand how that is an option if we wanted to reduce our transportation budget. And I also think I could easily say, we would all be at the guillotine doing that. But just so that people hear where our options are for cuts.
Right, and there's always options. That not getting rid of lottery schools, or maybe not providing the transportation, but still having them. There's different options like that, or something like compromises before we would just eliminate anything. And obviously, there would be a much larger discussion around that. The utility, and Ryan over here is our expert on utilities. Like our utility costs. Oh, I guess we're going to talk about. Sorry, I got ahead of ourselves. But our insurance first, and then I know I was excited. I was excited. Property and our insurance not so exciting. Utilities a little more exciting. But our property and liability insurance, we've had several conversations about this too. Like, we rebid our 5-year contract, and our insurance, it's one payment, so it doesn't really matter, but it's on a calendar year basis. And so this was for the 23-24 school year we just made for calendar year 2024. And we continue to see large increases in our property tax lines, and we've continued to have our insurance partners dig into these lines, and there's like also the communication. It's not our general liability. That's why I broke this out too. It's not our liability insurance. It's not because we're having all these lawsuits or this or that or other thing. What's driving this is a largely property insurance line, and that is because of just the property insurance, the market nationwide with catastrophic claims, and there's really not even a lot of insurance like underwriters that are really even willing to do individual entities that have a large footprint. And because we have 40 different buildings, when you see like these hurricanes in Florida and these type things that take out an entire district or something like that, or a tornado that would have significant, we don't even see a lot of underwriters even being willing to insure these anymore. And so the ones that are then they can increase their prices significantly. We are fortunate Travelers is willing to continue to cover all of our properties, so we don't have to piecemeal where we're having like one underwriter do a portion and some other person do another portion. But we have seen those prices continue to increase even prior to the rebid into 22-23 school year with a large increase. So I do project that we're going to have an increase again. Our liability insurance, again, it does increase a little bit each year, not at the same rate. The property insurance is increasing, but you can see there then our total over as a smaller percentage of the total, but our total insurance for between last year and this year still was almost a 13%. So that's what I'm projecting again. I mean, I don't know they're projecting even talking with our partners, saying they've seen anywhere between 10 and 25% increases in these different insurance lines. And so we're really fortunate that we have Assured Partners continues to work with us and do the underwriting and contact to try and keep our rates as low as possible. But it's definitely something that we have to consider each year.
What's the total valuation of property that's under that?
Oh, that's a good question. We just looked at this. I don't know. I can't remember either. We had a new statement of values and they went out and reassessed. So that was also part of when between 22-23 and 23-24, like that was also a driver of that property insurance, is because they did all the values with the new underwriter that came in. And so because the values of our property increased so much, that also is taken into consideration of the replacement value that they would have to, take into consideration if for liability if something were to happen.
I mean, I do know that across the nation, insurance costs are going up a tremendous amount. So, I mean, 12, 13%, I mean,
Yeah, so
it's better than could be.
right, yep, exactly. So like we had some, they provided some like market, if there was additional questions, some economic outlooks. And so it's like anywhere between 15 and 25% for that property insurance line for sure. And then our utilities is the last piece of our fixed costs that I kind of wanted to look at. And so we all know we have got a lot of money, that one-time money coming in from our federal stimulus money, and a lot of that money was put back into our HVAC systems. And so I had our utility manager who was out at our facilities building pull some information for that. And we are running a lot more efficiently in some of those buildings. And so we have seen over the last couple of years that our insurance or our utilities have been pretty flat, and that is because of some efficiencies. Even so, even though some rates that we're seeing increase, also we have to remind ourselves this year did have a couple cold weeks in January, but last year was very mild in the winter, and so that really affects the electric and gas bills in those winter months. And so when you look at the final for 22-23, why there was that decrease, that has to be taken into consideration as well. But really projecting for 23 basically flat from last year, which is really great news. You have any insight for us for our rates?
She already called him out earlier, so
Right.
just let him.
Sadly, I don't think your 5% will be enough.
You don't think it's going to be enough?
No, I don't. I mean,
Yeah.
I can't speak for City of Columbia or Ameren UE or in totality, but just understanding the industry and where things are going.
We
I
had
would
the same
expect-
conversation last year, and so I projected 5% last year, and they said that, and then we came in under, but I do think there was all things considered equal. If there wasn't anything else and other upgrades and stuff going on, then to be able to cause that, I mean, that's a one-time thing, so we're not going to see that year after year.
Electricity sales in the previous year were down about 7%, just
Yeah.
comparative, and that's just weather related.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that's why when I saw the 5%, for 2023, then that made sense, just because I knew things like that, like the mild weather and stuff, does affect that.
Would you say like a more of a double-digit projected increase for us
No,
to kind of
I don't think
consider?
so. I mean, you're not completely out of the realm, because, and I don't know the HVAC systems in all your schools, the usage of natural gas versus electricity. Obviously, the schools that you've been replacing with new buildings are significantly more energy efficient, use a lot less electricity and things like that. So, it's in balance, and the biggest thing is always going to be weather, and the last several years have been pretty mild. So
And sorry, I know that puts you on the spot, and nothing that you share is a full, like, you should do this, but I do
Well, there's
appreciate
always
it, 'cause that
multiple
is-
variables with all these things involved, and that's where he's like, this could go up, but this also could cause it to decrease. And so when you're trying to predict, like, no, but none of us have like that magic 8 ball, like we can predict, but it is helpful.
you're going through your revenue numbers and looking at all the variables, and I do the same thing. So,
Yes.
for sure.
Well, that's good to know. Good to know. That who asked the property values? We were in the $800 million range, and then we went up to about over 825. So it went up significantly between 23-24 and 24-25. So the next slide just kind of shows the summary then of when we're looking at fixed costs, just without considering anything else. Basically, we're talking about an increase in $1 million to our operating budget. So that's something, and this is a good year, really, when we're talking about increases. So with our transportation and our increase for fixed costs next year, obviously, we already talked a little bit about that, is gonna be significantly higher, but about under $1 million, which is right over between a 4% and 5% increase in our fixed costs for next year for the 24-25 budget. And then the last thing, take out now that we've talked about all these different things, let's kind of talk about then what we're going to factor in and what we're going to start as we start building the 5-year model with some more concrete numbers. Right now, like what we talked about with our property tax, we have conservative increases in our assessed valuation in that 3% range annually. We have increases in the state funding for proposed increases for the state adequacy target for both this year and next year. Basically, we have transportation funding for this year, but probably not going to continue next year. Flat federal funding, all that stimulus money has to be used by the end of this year, so there's no continuation really of any additional federal funding that's flowing into the district. On the expenditure side, as we start bending next month when we meet again, is going to be all about expenditures. And we talked a lot about revenues tonight. The largest driver of our expenditures is salaries and benefits. That's 80%. We're going to start talking about salary schedules and approved compensation, the kind of salary compensation plan for the next 5 years, what that looks like. And that includes step increases. Again, when we're talking about step increases, that just means stepping down on the salary schedule. That doesn't mean an additional any money into improvements of salary schedule. That just means increases for you to step down. And just to step employees each year is about $3 million. So the 3% in assessed valuation is in the $3 million range. So if we have no other new revenue each year, basically that's revenue to cover what we're giving to step raises. So if you talk about any additional raises or additional expenditures or additional money in fixed costs, all that is either coming from other additional revenue sources or fund balance. It also, we need to take into consideration we're going to open a new school here as we transitioned into a long-range facilities committee here in a minute as well. It's all intertwined. So I do have funding in there for all the new positions that are going to go into that new school. We know some teachers will move from other schools, but we know you're going to have a new principal, a new assistant principal, secretary, custodial, all those kind of positions, specialist positions that go into that new school. So all that is factored into the 5-year model. Continued fully funding of benefits for all years in the 5-year model. Funding for projected increases in that transportation contract that we know is already approved, that we have to, that we're committed to funding for 25, 26 and beyond. But right now, there is no accounting for any kind of future legislation that may negatively affect the revenue, including any kind of charter schools, open enrollment, limitations on property taxes, any of that. None of that right now is, we don't have specific dollars amounts for any of that right now to be able to factor that in. So that's what we're going to start really honing in on in the next, before I see you guys again next month, how all that is going to funnel out and before we go for our final budget approval in June. So that, I know that was a lot. Does anybody else have any questions, suggestions, edits, concerns?
I guess more in adding into that summary, right? So just to understand fully, what will be in this model, that the draft model that we end up seeing next month in Finance Committee, is going to have all those things that we've talked about here with increases, but it does not have any of those concerns that we know of. If, per se, a movement occurs and something does go there, would we be able to have numbers, or would it just be too soon of that legislation?
Not by next month, but the state legislature is out in May, and so we would be able to have something before their final budget that goes to the board, but not before the April session.
Okay. Effectively, we'll know if we have all of the money that we think we have, and not,
Correct.
hey, this new thing is coming in and we're losing $5 million a year or whatever it is.
Right.
Out of all the things that you looked at on that slide, talking about the potential negative impacts to revenue, what's the one that gives you the most immediate heartburn?
Charter schools. That's the one that keeps me up at night.
Do you think, but that wouldn't impact it wouldn't impact 24, 25, really, would it? You, I mean, is
Right,
it,
in the 5-year model, so,
Okay.
right, it probably wouldn't the first year, but like definitely by 25, 26, and they usually say even like a conservative estimate, they say the first year would be 100 students, and so that's the thing, like, we have 19,000 students, so 100 students doesn't seem like that much, but that's when it's like $13,000 a student, that would follow, the funding would follow through, but we can't reduce our expenditures to be able to account for that because one kid here and 2 kids there across, so you can't reduce your staffing to equate to that amount of money that you're losing in people and scholars and students in seat.
just be careful who you sell old school buildings to.
Yeah. Yes,
And
right.
And like the other thing on that open enrollment side, yes, we might net out seeing more students come in to our district with an open enrollment, but most of the bills that I've seen only move the state funds over. So we're not going to see any of the local funds that come there, and anything also, it really is, I mean, kids that might come over here as our surrounding areas, we have a larger local tax base than them. So even if that local tax dollars did follow, we would have less money that would come per kid than what we normally have here locally.
Right.
And so that's, I mean, charter schools are the heartburn one, but that open enrollment is one of those that it's like, it's such a weird thing because we would be having more students come in while getting really less money.
Right. And the property tax stuff layered on top of each other, multiple layers of that stuff. Really, like there's the state stuff, but then when you're starting to talk about the effect on our local, which we already are, we're very highly supported by our community, and we know that's very important to us. Like when you start talking about limitations on that funding, that's scary as well.
Well, if there is no other questions, thank you, Heather, for giving us the high joys and the lows and the potential worries of our finances. I think that there is some great optimism to be there while also understanding that there's some looming giants that could come in our neighborhood. With that, do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
I have a motion and a second. All those in favor of adjournment, please raise your hand and say aye. Aye. All those opposed, please do the same. All right, we are adjourned at 5:37, and we will then have long-range facilities